Hey bro, what's going on? All right, let's get straight into this because the new Silksong update dropped, and it's one of those patches that doesn't scream in your face with huge flashy additions, but instead slips in and quietly fixes, polishes, and reshapes a surprising amount of stuff. The internal build number for this update is version 1.029242, and that's the one and only time I'm saying it because you asked not to repeat it, but trust me, that number is doing a lot of heavy lifting. This whole conversation flows out of what that build changed under the hood, how it affects gameplay, and even how it smooths out some pretty loud community frustrations. Right off the bat, the biggest fix for a lot of players is the translation overhaul. The simplified Chinese localization at launch didn't land well, and if you ever peeked at those community threads, you know how rough the reception was. Lines felt awkward, metaphors didn't match the tone of the world, and a lot of emotional beats just didn't hit. So, what did the devs do? They didn't just tweak it, they actually picked up a fan-made translation from a group known for doing high-quality fixes and folded it straight into the official game. That is such a rare thing to see. A studio embracing community work to clean up a part of the game that wasn't living up to expectations. The difference is noticeable immediately. Characters sound like themselves again, lore descriptions are consistent, and the whole vibe feels closer to what you want from something in the Hollow Knight family. It was a huge win for players who had been waiting for a proper voice in their language, and honestly, it's the kind of move that buys a lot of goodwill. But let's switch gears to something that sounds boring unless you've personally suffered through controller issues. The game has migrated to Unity's newer input system. I know it sounds like a tech note from a developer blog, but it absolutely affects gameplay. This switch changes how the game interprets controllers across different devices, and that means more stable detection, fewer random disconnect moments, better rumble consistency, and an overall cleaner feel when your mid-fight and muscle memory matters. Before this patch, some people had issues where their controller behaved differently between sessions, or rumble would just decide to check out. That's the stuff that breaks immersion and can ruin tense encounters. With the new input system, everything moves closer to predictable modern behavior. Some weird quirks might still float around, but the baseline experience is way more solid now. And speaking of consoles, let's clear up the confusion that always happens whenever updates hit different platforms. Even though the internal build is the same everywhere, the numbering on consoles might look different from PC. That's normal. It's just how each platform labels updates depending on its own pipeline. What matters is that the actual content, the translation fix, the input overhaul, the gameplay adjustments, is identical across the board now. PC got it first, consoles followed after certification, but everyone's on the same page in terms of what's actually changed. Now let's talk gameplay tweaks, because this patch is full of those small but important nudges. One of the weird behaviors that got cleaned up is how the game handles the plasmified state. There were moments when players would enter that state after killing the wrong enemy or using an item in a way the game didn't intend. Those inconsistencies felt off and are now corrected so things behave more logically. Multi-binder also got some adjustments, especially around bind timing. Before, there were moments where shifting binds could accidentally lock you into longer bind durations than expected, and clearing maggots didn't always behave in the way players thought it should. That's been tightened up, so the item feels more dependable in the heat of battle. Wreath of Purity's durability got a boost too, which might sound tiny, but it changes survivability math in longer fights. You know how certain fights just chip away at you slowly? Well, increasing durability means you get that little extra cushion to avoid those cheap-feeling situations. And there was this odd environmental bug where the void could conduct electricity in ways that didn't make sense. That's been smoothed out so hazards behave consistently instead of surprising you with random zap moments. Enemy behavior saw love too. One standout example is Gur the Outcast, whose trap-throwing attack was updated. Before, there were moments where he'd sort of stall or do attack sets that didn't add much to the rhythm of the fight. Now, the attack pattern is more fluid and dynamic, keeping the encounter moving and reducing those awkward pauses where nothing much happens. Not a giant change, but it adds to that feeling that each fight has been polished just a little more. And then there's the balance stuff that people only notice once they're in the nitty-gritty of the game. Some creatures had interactions that let players cheese them in ways the devs didn't intend. For example, resetting certain enemies by leaving and re-entering a scene would let them bounce back to full HP and behave in ways that players used to exploit certain strategies. Those patterns have been adjusted, not by smashing them with nerfs, but by trimming just enough of the exploit potential to keep the game's intended difficulty curve intact. It's also worth talking about how meaningful that translation change is beyond the obvious. Officially adopting a fan-made translation marks a moment where the studio acknowledges that parts of the community can sometimes fill gaps better than internal resources alone. And it's not just about text accuracy. It brings the game's voice back in line with player expectations. The devs have mentioned they're continuing to refine localization moving forward, so this patch feels like a foundation rather than a final word. Back to the controller talk for a moment, because this is one of the changes people notice even if they don't realize why. With the new input backend, players using less common controllers, third-party brands, adapters, custom setups should find more consistent performance. And rumble behavior is way less flaky now. Before this update, some players had moments where rumble disappeared mid-session or didn't trigger for certain attacks. That's the kind of thing you only miss when it's gone, especially in a game that relies on subtle cues. Having that back at a stable level boosts the tactile feel of the entire experience, especially for boss fights. Stability fixes weren't flashy, but they matter just as much. Soft locks, scene transition bugs, and weird little hiccups in animations were cleaned up. You know those moments where the game doesn't crash, but it gets stuck just enough to ruin a run? Those are the ones that patches like this tackle. With so much movement, wall jumping, and quick directional changes, Silksong needs to be airtight to feel fair. This patch closes up cracks that most players might never see, but people who run deeper into the game's systems definitely felt. And community reaction has been interesting. A lot of people were relieved about the translation fix, especially those who had been waiting since launch for it to get addressed. Others focused on the controller improvements because those were affecting tons of players quietly in the background. And then you have the crowd asking for deeper transparency in patch notes, which is understandable. Players who care about tiny mechanical interactions want granular explanations. But even with the minimal formatting we get, the tone of the reaction is pretty positive overall. It feels like one of those updates that aims for steady improvement instead of sweeping changes. Finally, let's touch one more time on update timing. Because PC got the build earlier, console players naturally wondered if they were getting the same content or something different. But no. The internal build is the unifying factor. The difference you see in update titles or numbers is purely platform-side labeling, nothing more. Everyone is playing with the same fixes and improvements now, which keeps the player base aligned no matter where they're playing. So that's the whole rundown, and it's a big one, even if it doesn't look gigantic on paper. The update refines translation through an officially adopted fan effort, stabilizes and modernizes controller handling with the input system upgrade, adjusts gameplay quirks that were messing with flow, and brings all platforms in sync under one consistent build. It's not about transforming the game into something new, it's about making the version we already love smoother, cleaner, and more dependable in the places people actually feel it moment to moment.